So, in the last class, we had discussed barriers to communication. So, we had discussed two barriers already. So, is there any doubt regarding the two barriers that I had discussed in the last class? That is psychological barrier and physical barrier. Do you have any doubts regarding these two barriers? So, if there is any doubt, you can ask me. So, I would just like to repeat it once again. Psychological barrier is related to the limitations of the human mind. When you don't concentrate and listen to the speaker, that is a psychological barrier. When you come to conclusions too soon, that is also a psychological barrier. So I had given you a few examples of psychological barrier as well. So whenever we do not concentrate, or whenever we do not listen to the other person then or think about something else, so these things create psychological barrier. Okay, then we had also discussed about physical barrier. So physical barrier is basically the environmental or natural conditions that act as a barrier in communication, in sending or receiving messages. All right, so I had also given you a few examples, like when you are geographically separated, when you live in one state and when your parents live in another, so whenever you want to meet them personally, you won't be able to do that, isn't it? So that is a physical barrier. So is there any doubt related to these two barriers? If not, then I can move ahead.
Hello, ma'am.
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah.
Ma'am, how to overcome psychological barriers like poor retention or loss by transmission?
Uh, I did not get your point. Can you repeat it once again?
And can we overcome these psychological barriers like
Yeah, of
poor
course we
retention
can. Yeah, of
or loss by
course. Of course, we can overcome these barriers, and definitely we can avoid these barriers. All right. So we will be discussing about these as well. So like how to overcome the barriers later on. First of all, we'll be discussing about the barriers, and of course we can overcome the barriers. We can avoid these barriers. All right. So psychological barrier, as I had already said, it is totally related to our to the limitations of our brain, isn't it? To it is related to our thoughts, it is related to the way, it is related to the way we think, isn't it? So for example, if you are not attentive, you are not concentrating on what the speaker is trying to say, then that is considered as a psychological barrier, isn't it? That is a cause of a psychological barrier, isn't it? Lack of attention is a cause of psychological barrier. When you don't listen to the other person properly, or you're thinking about something else, you're not giving proper attention, that is a psychological barrier, isn't it? So how can we get rid of that, or how can we just overcome that barrier? We need to listen to the other person properly, so we need to concentrate. If we don't concentrate, a psychological barrier will be created, and if we concentrate, definitely we can overcome that barrier. So that's how we can overcome all the barriers. So there's not a single barrier which we cannot overcome. uh, we will be discussing about the methods of overcoming the barriers in the uh, next class. Once I complete explaining you the barriers, I'll be discussing about how to overcome these barriers. All right, I hope your point is clear now.
Okay, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Hmm. So today I will be discussing about cultural barriers. So, cultural barrier is related to the different cultures. Now, we live in India, and India is a country where uh, there are different cultures, isn't it? India is a country where we'll find many cultures, and each and every culture is beautiful in its own ways, isn't it? But sometimes the cultural differences might be a barrier when we communicate with people. Sometimes our cultures can be a barrier when we communicate with some other person who is from another cultural. So, when we work in an organization, there are a lot of people in an organization, there are a lot of people, isn't it? So, how to work with each and every individual properly, how to communicate with each and everyone properly when they come from different cultures. Because, as we all know, India is a country with many cultures, isn't it? So sometimes the differences in language, the differences in the cultural beliefs, or use of different gestures and symbols to communicate might create some kind of differences in the workplace, or just in general. Not only in workplace but also just in general, sometimes the differences in the language, the use of different gestures, the different symbols to communicate with one another, the different beliefs might create some kind of barrier, hindrance in the process of communication, in the process of free flow of communication. हम लोग के कंट्री में बहुत सारे कल्चर्स है, isn't it? So यही कल्चर कभी कभार क्या होता है, दिस कैन एक्ट एज अ बैरियर, बिकॉज हर एक कल्चर के कुछ अपने बिलीव्स होते हैं, कुछ अपने ट्रेडिशंस होते हैं, कुछ अपने रिचुअल्स होते हैं, कुछ साइंस होते हैं अपने कल्चर के, एंड देन द लैंग्वेज माइट आल्सो डिफर, isn't it? So इसके वजह से कभी कभार क्या होता है, कम्युनिकेशन के वक्त प्रॉब्लम हो सकता है, कभी कभार इसके वजह से कम्युनिकेट करते वक्त मिसअंडरस्टैंडिंग्स क्रिएट हो सकता है, क्योंकि हर एक कल्चर का अपना एक खुद का ट्रेडिशन होता है, अपने खुद के रिचुअल्स होते हैं, लैंग्वेजेस आर डिफरेंट, दैन बात करने का तरीका, रहने का तरीका, खाने पीने का, एवरीथिंग. सो there's a lot of difference, in different हम जब एक कल्चर को दूसरे कल्चर के साथ कंपेयर करते हैं, when we compare one culture with another culture, so we'll find a lot of differences, and those differences sometimes might create a problem in the process of communication. ठीक है, I hope I'm clear with this कि how can a culture act as a barrier in the process of communication? So, when you meet people from different cultures, when you have to communicate with people who come from different cultures, they might speak a different language, they might have different beliefs, or they might use different gestures and symbols to communicate, which you might not understand or which you might misunderstand. So, these cultural differences might become a barrier in the process of communication. ठीक है? I hope it's clear. Is there any doubt regarding cultural barrier? Is there any doubt regarding cultural barrier, students? Alright, so I assume that there's no doubt and you have understood. Next barrier is language barrier. So, how do we communicate? We use a language to communicate, isn't it? We need a language to communicate. If there is no language, we won't be able to orally communicate, or we won't be able to communicate properly, isn't it? So, now again, India is a country with several languages, isn't it? So, now we don't understand each and every language, isn't it? We maximum we have a knowledge of like 3, 4, 5, 6 knowledges at maximum, but we are unaware, we do not understand all the languages that is spoken within the country. I'm not talking about the languages, I'm leaving the languages, which are spoken outside the country, because India already has too many languages, isn't it? India has a lot of languages. People in India speak different languages, and I and you, an individual, has knowledge of only certain languages, and we are not able to understand most of the languages. Now, this language is the one with the help of which we communicate with one another. बात करनी है तो हम कैसे बात करेंगे? एक लैंग्वेज के जरिए ही तो बात करेंगे, है कि नहीं? नाउ आई एम यूजिंग द लैंग्वेज इंग्लिश एंड हिंदी टू कम्युनिकेट, and the other language that I know is Assamese. So I will be able to communicate with you all in these three languages. Apart from these three languages, I won't be able to communicate with you in any other language. So that is why if you try to communicate with me in some another language, then I won't be able to understand what you are trying to say, isn't it? So in that case, language can be a barrier, and in India, language is something that can definitely be a barrier, because in India there are several languages. People speak different languages. Even in one state, people speak in different languages. Hindi is something that is nationally used, isn't it? It is a language, Hindi is a language that is nationally used. Yet, you go to the south, they won't be able to understand Hindi. It is used nationally, but still people cannot understand Hindi in some places, isn't it? So, language, when there is a barrier, when there is a problem, when you try to communicate with other people in your own language, then that particular barrier is known as language barrier. All right, जब हम बात करते हैं, communicate करते हैं, एक common language का we need a common language, isn't it? एक common language की ज़रूरत होती है. अगर कॉमन लैंग्वेज है नहीं हम लोगों के बीच में, तो हम कम्युनिकेट नहीं कर पाएंगे. साइंस यूज करके, सिंबल्स यूज करके, एक्सप्रेशंस यूज करके कब तक बात करेंगे, है कि नहीं? पॉसिबल नहीं है. लिखने से भी पता नहीं चलेगा, क्योंकि कॉमन लैंग्वेज है नहीं. तो लैंग्वेज चाहिए to communicate orally as well as to write something, isn't it? तो लैंग्वेज, अगर कॉमन लैंग्वेज है ही नहीं कुछ भी, तो then definitely we won't be able to communicate with one another. So in India there are 22 official language, which includes Assamese, Bengali, Hindi, then Gujarati, Konkani, Bodo, Sanskrit. So these are the languages. There are 22 official languages in India, and apart from these official languages, there are several others. So that is why it's not possible for a single person to know all the language. So sometimes it might act as a barrier. All right. Then the next is gender barrier. Now, this is another important barrier which you need to know. We basically have two genders, isn't it? One is male and another is female. So there are a lot of differences between a man and a women, isn't it? There are a lot of differences between a way a man lives his life, and a way a woman lives her life. Uh, so sometimes these differences, these patterns of, the way they live their life, the way the men live their life, the way the women live their life, the differences in their patterns might act as a barrier. Whereas gender barriers have, like, gone to zero nowadays, but still at some point of time it exists, and it's a fact and reality that sometimes being a girl, I might not understand what a man is going through. I might not understand what a man is feeling. And being a man might not sometimes understand what a woman faces, what a woman goes through. So that is why these differences might create a barrier in case of communication, and that particular problem or hindrance can be regarded as gender barrier. So I would just like to give you a small example. So decision making is something that a woman does, that a man too does, isn't it? So the differences in the decision making process is when it is different from one another. There is a man and there is a woman, and their decision making process is different from one another. That is because of the gender. That is because the way they have experienced life, the way they have lived their life, it depends. The decisions totally depends upon that. So sometimes it might create a barrier in the process of communication. All right, is there any doubt regarding gender barriers? So here itself I have given an example that a woman speaks a lot of words in a day, whereas comparatively man speaks lesser. So this is another example that I have provided here itself. So there's a lot of differences in between the genders. So sometimes those differences might create a misunderstanding, or sometimes it might stop the free flow of communication. Is it clear, students? Is it clear? Next is interpersonal barriers. Now, interpersonal barriers are something that we face when we communicate with others. When the other person is not interested to listen to you, when the other person is like, the other person doesn't like you, then there will be definitely a problem in the process of communication. You won't be able to communicate with the other person properly. So, interpersonal barriers are the barriers between two people due to, I have given few examples, due to lack of participation and lack of mindedness. Open mindedness. So, lack of participation is something when the other person is not at all interested, or the other person is unwilling to communicate with you, and you are trying to force him, and you are trying to force a conversation. You are trying and you're trying to talk to that person, but that person is not at all interested. So in that case, interpersonal barrier will definitely take place. Next is lack of open mindedness. So when your thoughts are limited, when you're not open to different views and opinions, then definitely there will be a barrier in the process of, it will act as a barrier in the process of communication. So that is why we need to be flexible, we need to be little bit flexible so that we can understand the views of the other people, opinions of the other people. It might be different, it might be totally different, but when you understand it and when you can accept certain things, then definitely you can overcome that barrier. But once you do not try to understand the views of the other person, the views and opinions of the other person, then definitely there will be an interpersonal barrier. All right. So interpersonal barrier is basically the barriers that takes place, the problems that takes place when you try to communicate with others due to lack of participation, when the other person is not at all willing to communicate with you, or you are, or suppose the other person is trying to tell you something and you are totally busy in doing some other work. So that is interpersonal barrier, and you won't be able to communicate properly. You will there are chances that you might end up fighting, or there might be a misunderstanding. So definitely we can overcome this, but sometimes lack of participation, lack of open mindedness, when we refuse to explore the different points of view or opinions, so that can end up in interpersonal barriers. All right. Next is emotional barriers. Now we human beings, we have a lot of emotions, isn't it? Sometimes we are happy, sometimes we are sad, sometimes we are angry, depressed, frustrated, sometimes we are just blank, isn't it? So we have a lot of emotions, and these emotions are a very important part of our life, isn't it? We are humans because we have emotions. If we would not have any emotions, then we would have been robots, isn't it? Now these emotions sometimes can stop the free flow of communication. How? Because sometimes when you are angry and the other person is trying to say you something, your anger is going to stop the free flow of communication, because you won't be able to understand the other person at that point of time, because you are angry, because you are at a different zone. So you won't be able to understand the other person, and you won't be able to communicate with the other person properly. Next, anxiety. When like you face anxiety, when you're too anxious, then definitely it might result in misunderstandings. It might also create uh, certain issues. It might create a lot of differences between two individuals. So our emotions can definitely stop. Our emotions, if not used properly, if uh, it is not controlled, then definitely our emotions can act as a barrier in the process of communication and stop the free flow of communication. All right. The last one is physiological barriers in the process of communication. So physiology, what is physiology? So it is the state of human body of mind. So your when you're not able to communicate with the other person due to certain physical conditions, okay, due to certain physical problems or mental problem, then that is known as physiological barrier. All right. So if a person has physical disabilities, so if the person is physically not fit, okay, then that might act as a barrier in the process of communication. So how can physiological barriers occur? So I have given few examples. So these are some of the causes of physiological barrier: deafness and hearing impairment. So when somebody is not able to hear properly, then definitely there'll be a problem in the process of communication, isn't it? When you are trying to talk to a person who cannot hear, so then definitely that is going to be a barrier that is going to create certain issues in the process of communication, because the other person cannot hear you. How are you supposed to share the information or your opinion with that person who cannot hear you? So this is basically a cause of physiological barrier. Next is blindness and vision impairment. So if somebody is blind, somebody cannot see properly, then of course, if when you're trying to explain something, that person cannot see you, when you're trying to show him something, that person cannot see you, then that will act as a barrier in the process of communication. Speech disorders, जब हम अच्छे से बात नहीं कर पाते, बहुत लोगों का ये प्रॉब्लम होता है, बहुत फास्ट बात करते हैं या अच्छे से बात रुक रुक के बात करते हैं, तो those people face a lot of problem while communicating with others, because वो जो बोल रहे हैं दूसरे लोगों को समझ में नहीं आ रहा है, और दूसरा इंसान जो उसके साथ कम्युनिकेट करने की कोशिश कर रहा है उसको भी प्रॉब्लम होता है, क्योंकि वो उसको समझ में नहीं आ रहा है वो क्या बोलने की कोशिश कर रहा है. So this can cause physiological barriers. And the last one is memory. So मेमोरी अगर मतलब कुछ प्रॉब्लम होता है, व्हेन यू आर नॉट एबल टू रिकॉल सर्टेन थिंग्स, जब मेमोरी लॉस होता है, ओके जब भूल जाते हैं लोग कुछ चीज़ें लाइफ का एक पार्ट, तो दैट कैन ऑल्सो एक्ट एज अ physiological barrier. So basically these are the 8 barriers in the process of communication which can stop the free flow of communication. So if you have any doubts regarding any of the barriers, then quickly you can ask me. If there is any doubt, you can ask. Hmm? I am not being able to hear you properly. Yes, please tell me. Is interpersonal barrier a physiological barrier? For example, when a person is talking to himself or thinking something and suddenly someone call him or her and the person gets disturbed. No, I intrapersonal barrier. No, that you there's no such barrier actually, intrapersonal barrier, because intrapersonal is related to only yourself. When you try to have a when you try to communicate with yourself, when you try to understand yourself, when you try to have a conversation with yourself. So हम कैसे conversation करते हैं खुद के साथ, ऐसे सोचते हैं, जो हम सोचते हैं that is only intrapersonal communication. So there is no such kind of barrier as an intrapersonal barrier. ठीक है, द माइट बी इंटरपर्सनल, दो लोगों के बीच में बैरियर हो सकता है कम्युनिकेशन करते वक्त, बट देयर इज नो व्हेन यू आर थिंकिंग समथिंग एंड व्हेन सडनली कॉल्स यू, दैट इज साइकोलॉजिकल बैरियर, and you're not being able to understand what the other person is saying. So there, when you are totally thinking about something else and when suddenly comes and tries to communicate with you, you won't be able to communicate with that person properly because you are already occupied with something. So that is psychological barrier. Okay, another important thing I would just like to share with you all is that as in most of the students they use the spelling MEM. Okay, this is incorrect. MEM is incorrect. Okay, it's MA apostrophe AM, ma'am. or you can just also use MAM, but MEM is totally incorrect. Those who use MEM, this is incorrect. Okay, MEM का spelling MA''AM होता है, MEM नहीं होता है. इंटरनेशनल बैरियर अभी क्या हो गया ऋषिता? व्हाट इज इंटरपर्सनल? आई गेस इंटरपर्सनल जब दो इंसान के बीच में ड्यू टू लैक ऑफ पार्टिसिपेशन या ड्यू टू लैक ऑफ लाइक ड्यू टू लैक ऑफ रिजिड थिंकिंग जब बैरियर्स क्रिएट होता है तो दैट इज ओनली नोन एज इंटरपर्सनल बैरियर. When two people are not being able to communicate with one another properly because one person is trying to communicate with the other person, but the other person is not at all interested, not at all willing to talk to the person, so then there will be an interpersonal barrier in the process of communication. Psychological barrier, and I would also like to just inform you that the meeting will be ending soon. Okay, it might be disconnected at any moment, so you can drop your questions if you have any in the WhatsApp group. Psychological barrier is related to the limitations of a human mind. Psychological barrier directly relate करता है, that directly is related to our mind. Okay, it is totally related to our mind, the way we think, the way we share, the way we process. So whenever there is a lack of attention, that can be regarded as a psychological barrier. जब हम चीज़ें याद नहीं कर पाते या याद करने की अगर कोशिश कर रहे हैं तो वी आर नॉट बीइंग एबल टू like remember the certain important things, that can be a psychological barrier. When the information passes from one person to other, then to the next person, then to the next person, and by the time it reaches the last person, that means suppose the 10th person, the message is totally changed, or only the 10% of the message is what that the 10th person receives. So that can be also a psychological barrier. Okay, it is totally related to our thinking. It is totally related to our mind, the capacity of our mind to remember things, the capacity of our mind to understand things, the capacity of our mind to judge things. So these things can create a psychological barrier. Is gender barrier only related to speech patterns? No, that is just an example that I had given. Gender barrier, there are a lot of things which might create gender barrier. Ritik Mohan, speech patterns, that is just an example that I had given. That is just an example. Gender barriers might be caused due to many other reasons. All right. Yeah, like the way a woman thinks, the way a woman thinks and the way a man thinks, it's totally different from one another. So the differences in their lifestyle, the differences in their opinions, in their thoughts, the differences in